The last half of the book of Nehemiah concerns some of the final reforms during the period of Nehemiah. We've already seen how that Nehemiah was instrumental in leading the people to complete the walls, to hang the gates, and now they have one additional issue they're going to have to look at. The fact that the city is quite large, but there's not very many people living in it. And as you get to the end of chapter 7 of Nehemiah, you'll notice that right in the very end of the chapter, there is going to be once again a mention of the 7th month. Early on, we talked about the importance of the 7th month because it is the last great festival month of the Jews. And this would be the month Tishri, roughly the September-October period within the English calendar. And during this time, there will be the three major festivals of trumpets, of atonement, which is Yom Kippur, and then the festival of booths, which is the week-long festival of Sukkot. And it may be helpful just to once again review the kinds of things that would happen during the 7th month. According to the Torah in Leviticus and Numbers, the Festival of Trumpets is a memorial blowing of trumpets. It's a one-day festival in which there is a sabbatical day, a very solemn assembly, and at some point this also becomes the beginning of the Jewish civil year, what today still is called Rosh Hashanah. In the very early part of the Torah, in the time of the Exodus, the beginning of the year would of course be the first month of the year, whereas Tishri is the 7th month of the year. But at some point, and probably during the Babylonian captivity, Rosh Hashanah seems to coincide roughly with the Feast of Trumpets. During this time, there is a public reading of the Torah, and we know that this is carried into the post-exilic period. And then there is the one-day festival called Yom Kippur. This is the Day of National Atonement. This is the day in which the high priest will enter into the holy place to offer atonement for the nation itself. Actually, the priest would enter the most holy place 3 times on this particular day. First, to offer incense. Second, to offer blood for his own purification. And then to offer blood for the atonement of the people. And this is also the date for the scapegoat ritual, or to use the Hebrew term, the Azazel goat ritual, in which the goat is selected, hands of the priest are placed upon the goat, the sins of the nation are confessed over the goat, and the goat is driven out into the desert. So this is the Yom Kippur ritual. And then finally, near the end of the month, there is the festival of Sukkot, or the festival of booths. This was a week-long celebration with an 8th day convocation at the end of it, in which there are regular daily offerings, and it celebrates the completion of the harvest season. This is the last great festival of the year. Children camping out with their parents, of course, enjoyed this one very much. And this is the time we now have arrived at as we open up in Nehemiah chapter 8. Well, Nehemiah begins to read from the Torah. He reads from the text, and as you'll notice in chapter 8 and verse 1, the text is going to shift from the first person to the third person. This may mean that someone other than Ezra or someone other than Nehemiah has actually composed this part, since it's written in the third person. And you'll also notice there is this interesting expression that the reading was for those who could understand. Now, since Ezra is reading from the Torah, he is reading in Hebrew, but not everyone could understand Hebrew any longer. The Jews have been in exile for several decades in Babylon, and the international language, at least of the day, was Aramaic. Many of the people who had lived in Babylon during this time, and particularly those who probably were born to Jewish families during the exile, had begun to pick up Aramaic as their lingua franca, their basic conversational language. By the time the Jews have returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, many of these young people who had come from Babylon, they had never actually been in Jerusalem before, and they were no longer conversant in Hebrew. So for those who could not understand the reading of the Torah, that would be the Aramaic-speaking part of the Jews, the Levites assisted them with explanations, either by translating the text from Hebrew into Aramaic or giving the sense of the text you're going to find different English translations render that differently. The Jerusalem Bible uses the word translate. The English Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version gives something like giving the sense of. But this is the first real biblical description of Scripture translation. Translation will become more and more important as we go in the centuries to follow. Eventually the Jews will translate their Hebrew Bible into Greek. Christians will begin to translate the Hebrew Bible and the Christian documents of the New Testament into languages like Latin and Ethiopic and Georgian and so on. But this is the first real example of Bible translation, where a text is read in one language, in this case the language of Hebrew, and then the Levites are assisting with explanations or translations of that text into a second language. Another thing you notice in this passage is that the reading is conducted from what in Hebrew is called a migdal eitz. This is a phrase that means a tower of wood. Now, we're not sure whether this tower of wood means a pulpit or lectern, similar to the one that I have my laptop on here. It could refer to that. In fact, some English translations are going to say that. The Revised Standard Version and the American Standard Version, for instance, are going to use the term pulpit. Or it could mean a platform, a raised area where the reader is at a higher eye level than the people who are sitting or standing. The New International Version, for instance, uses the term platform, and the New American Bible, the Roman Catholic translation, uses that term. But whatever it is a term, either whether it means pulpit or platform, it is a term that is carried on into later centuries. And in fact, this is why even today in the 21st century, most churches have a platform or they have a pulpit. These ideas actually go all the way back to the book of Nehemiah and this reading of the Torah by Ezra in this ancient period. So as they begin reading, the passages that they read bring them to various passages, and one of them is about the Festival of Booths. Presumably, Ezra is reading from Leviticus 23, or what we call Leviticus 23. Of course, in that ancient time, there were no chapters and no verse divisions in the Bible. But Leviticus 23, at least in our Bibles, is a passage about the Festival of Booths. And when they read about the Festival of Booths, originally this created a certain amount of agitation because the people realized, maybe for the first time, how much they had departed from the ancient covenant and the practices of the covenant. So as you get to the beginning of chapter 9, you find some consternation on the part of the people because they're not sure where they stand because of the fact that they have departed from the rituals of the Torah. But Ezra and Nehemiah and the Levites encourage the people. They say, don't give way to grief. Really, you should rejoice. You should celebrate because this is now sort of a new beginning for you. And so they encouraged the people and they told them that they could build booths just as the Torah stipulates. They would live for 7 days in the booths as a commemoration of the days of the festival, and they would practice it in the way that it was supposed to be practiced. So at the encouragement of Nehemiah and Ezra and all of the other leaders, the people do this very thing. They build booths and they celebrate for the whole week of the festival of Sukkot. And each day, Ezra continues publicly to read from the Torah as the people listen to the readings. As these readers are going forth and the people realize how in many ways they have violated the covenant, they have departed from the Torah, they begin to formally express their repentance for their sins as a nation. And so they divided the day. They listened to readings from the Torah in the morning hours, the first half of the daylight hours. We're not sure exactly what time they started, but sometime after sunrise. And then they spent the rest of the day, the second half of the day, confessing their sins and worshiping for the second half. So what you have in this passage of chapter 9 is you have two groups of Levites assisting the assembly in congregational responses. One group is leading in confession, the other group is leading in praise, and it's very much reminiscent of the ancient ceremony that once was conducted on the mounts of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal back in the book of Joshua. You may remember, if you're really familiar with those passages, that the book of Deuteronomy indicated that when they got to the land of Canaan, they were to stage a ceremony in which half of the people were on one slope of the mountain and half on the other, with the Levites in the valley in the middle, and they were to call back and forth the blessings and the curses of the covenant. Well, this is similar to that. You have two groups of Levites and the congregation in two bodies responding to each other. A number of the Psalms are written in ways that are anticipating this sort of antiphonal type of worship. If you are from a liturgical background, you may be familiar with antiphonal worship, because Christians who worship in the Roman Catholic tradition or the Eastern Orthodox tradition or the Anglican tradition and some other Protestant traditions still do worship in the antiphonal way, where there are readings and responses from the congregation to the clergy, or from one part of the congregation to the other. If you've ever been in an old Anglican church where you sat in the choir stalls on each side of the entryway toward the altar, you'll find that the readings and so on are sometimes conducted in that way. And some of the Psalms are created to especially enhance that type of worship. One of the most well-known, I suppose, would be Psalm 136, which has alternating lines in which every verse ends with for his mercy or his love endures forever. And so one side would say the first part of the verse, and the second part would be responded to by the other side, his mercy endures forever. And back and forth they go in this call and response type of worship. So this is what is happening now in chapter 9 in the book of Nehemiah. And this includes a Levitical prayer of confession. Now, this is a really, really interesting prayer. It begins with the exaltation of God as the creator of the universe, as the one who made covenant with Abraham, as the one who redeems Israel from Egypt, and finally as the one who gives the Torah at Mount Sinai. The interesting thing about this exaltation of God is that the meaning of God, the meaning of his character and his person, is described by his mighty acts in history. Sometimes people talk about God in rather abstract language, but this talks about God in very concrete language. This is the God who not only is something, he is the God who does something. He creates the universe, he makes covenant with Abraham, he redeems Israel from Egypt, he gives the law at Mount Sinai. So the way that Israel exalts God is by rehearsing his mighty acts in history. The faith of Israel is very much a historical faith, a faith that is grounded in the acts of God in history. And so this is what begins the prayer in the first several verses. Then it moves to the confession part of the prayer, which is a confession of their ancient violations of the covenant and their confession of God's mercy in response to their sin. In this particular part of the confession, they remember the rebellion of the golden calf when the people in the wilderness came to Mount Sinai, and when Moses was on the mountain, they worshiped a golden calf. And yet at the same time, they remember God's great mercy, God's great compassion. It was not withdrawn from the people. He did not simply obliterate them from the earth because of their idolatry. And in spite of their waywardness, God still gave to them the land of Canaan. He showed them mercy and compassion. And then finally, the confession moves on to covenant violation during the period of the judges and during the period of the monarchy. Again, you can see that this whole prayer is really drawn out of the ancient history of Israel. Theology and history are intertwined in Israel, and it's very evident in this prayer that this is the case. And finally, because at the end of the monarchy, the people of Israel had not corrected their course, they had not turned away from their idolatry and their covenant violation, there was no alternative left but for God to send them into exile. And the oppression that they experienced in exile of foreign domination continues right on into the Persian period. But all of this actually demonstrates that God can be trusted, that God's word is absolute. He keeps his word. He is merciful, he is long-suffering, he allowed the people to continue for a very long time in spite of their covenant violations. But at some point, if he's going to be truthful to himself, if he's going to be faithful to himself, he's going to have to do what he said he would do back in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28. and he did in fact send the people into exile. And so they confess this exile as part of their confession. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 9 and the beginning of chapter 10 in Nehemiah, and the people were so overwhelmed and impressed and convinced of the truth of this that the climax of this was a covenant renewal ceremony in which they are going to pledge themselves before God, before their leaders, before their priests, that they will fix their names to an actual written document, a written document that binds them to the covenant. So what they do is they actually do that. They put themselves under oath to obey the Torah. They promise that they will be religiously pure. They will not intermarry with pagans and pagan religion. They promise that they will be faithful in keeping Shabbat, which is the Sabbath day. They promise that they will bring gifts for the temple, which is of course their obligation to do. They promise to bring wood for the sacrificial fire so that the morning and the evening offerings can be offered without hesitation. And they promise to fulfill their obligation by bringing first fruits, the first fruit of their crops and of their herds, into the temple that has now been built. They promise to dedicate their firstborn to the Lord. And they promise to pay their tithes. In fact, another book in the Old Testament that is probably very closely related to this time period is the book of Malachi. And in the book of Malachi, you will find a rather famous passage about paying tithes, but it probably has to do with the people here in this context of covenant renewal. They are renewing their covenant with God, renewing their covenant to be faithful to the Torah, and because of that, they will pay their tithes just as the Torah requires them to do. In this photograph, you see a number of seal rings, personal seal rings, that are preserved in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And they are from about the time we're talking about, the time of Nehemiah. These are probably the type of rings that were used to seal the documents that they drew up in affirming their intention to be faithful to the covenant and to seal this with an oath. These are not obviously the actual rings that was used by Nehemiah, at least so far as we know they weren't. But they are the type of rings that would have been used in that time to seal the document, to affix their name or their seal to the document that they would be faithful. Now, here is a very interesting document which is in the State Museum in Berlin. This is called a Passover letter. This was discovered archaeologically, and it is an ancient text in Hebrew that dates to the 5th year of Darius II. And this is a letter from a certain Jew in Jerusalem by the name of Hananiah, or Hanani, which is the name of the brother of Nehemiah. The interesting thing about this letter is that it actually not only gives his name, Hananiah or Hanani, it also says he is the brother. And we are assuming, and most scholars would agree, that he is quite possibly the brother of Nehemiah, the one that is mentioned way back in chapter 1 in Nehemiah. Nehemiah eventually would have placed him in charge of Jerusalem. You find this in chapter 7 of Nehemiah. And this letter was evidently written in the atmosphere of reform, because everyone in Jerusalem is now very eager to be careful to obey the Torah, to keep the festivals, to observe the Passover, to observe the Feast of Weeks, to observe the festival of Sukkot, all of the pilgrim festivals and all of the other rituals that were connected with the temple. This letter is written to a Jewish community in Egypt who have now found their lodging place and their lifestyles in Egypt, and they are at a place that is called Elephantine. This is an area up the Nile River, a number of miles, quite a number of miles actually, from the mouth of the Nile, at a place called Elephantine, which is an island in the Nile River. And there was an extensive Jewish community there about this time. And so Hananiah, or Hanani, has sent this letter to the Jews in Elephantine and encouraged them that even though they are not living in Jerusalem, even though they are part of the scattered Jews now who live elsewhere in the world, they still should observe the Passover. They still should keep the festivals and be faithful in doing that. And it's just a rather interesting insight into the kind of reforms that were happening at that time and the kind of communication that was going on between the Jews in Jerusalem and the Jews in other parts of the world. At this point, there are communities of Jews in primarily 3 parts of the world. There are Jews living in Babylon, of course. These would be Jews who had gone there into exile but did not come back within any of the waves of movement that is coming back to Jerusalem. There is, of course, those exiles who have returned to Jerusalem. They have rebuilt the temple and the city walls, and now they're living there. And then there is the group of Jews that are living in Egypt. And they will be living there for the next several hundred years. They will live there all the way up into the time of Jesus. And it's likely, at least, that Mary and Joseph, when they took Jesus to Egypt when he was a baby, would have gone to stay with some of the Jews somewhere in the land of Egypt. Eventually, many of the Jews would settle in the area of Alexandria during the Hellenistic period of Egypt. But in any case, this letter is directly addressed to these Jews, and it's just a rather interesting artifact from this period of time in the Jewish communities. Earlier, I mentioned that the city was large, but the population was small. This is actually stated directly in chapter 7 and verse 4. So since the enclosure of Jerusalem is now secure, the gates are built, the walls are built and the gates are hung, now they have to decide how are they going to move people into the city. And so they decide they would do this by, of all interesting things, tithing. They would get a tithe of the people. Well, a tithe is a tenth of the people. And so they would choose them by lot, and 1/10 of the people would now begin to move into the city. The bulk of the community was now, as you can see in chapter 11, largely from 3 tribes. Benjamin and Judah, which were the southern nation, and Levi, that Levitical tribe that's associated with the temple. Now, in addition to that, there were probably some people from the northern clans that had fled south as refugees. In fact, in 1 Chronicles 9, in some of the genealogical records, you do actually find references to northern Israelites who made it into the south and are part now of this larger community. But for the most part, this community is from Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. In fact, that is where we get the name Jew from one. The name Jew comes from the term Judah, or Yehuda, and the term Jew basically means a person who comes from Judah. In the modern world, I think we probably use the term Jew in a little more broader sense to refer to probably anyone that identifies themselves with the ancient nation of Israel. But at least at this point, you begin finding the word Jew in the biblical text, and it refers to people from the land of Judah. The priests and the Levites are listed by pedigree in chapter 12. And then you find that they reinstate the traditional choirs that originally were designed by David back in the building of the first temple, or the time of the building of the first temple. Again, these are antiphonal choirs that will respond back and forth to each other, one calling one way, one responding in a different way. And so you find that described here in chapter 12 of Nehemiah. And you find a fuller description of the earlier version of that back in 1 Chronicles chapter 25. Then there is a dedication of the walls, and the narrative now resumes in the first person. So we're back in the first person of Nehemiah. Ceremonies of purification were conducted for the people, for the walls, for the gates. Presumably this included the sprinkling with water and blood, which is a type of purification that goes back to the Levitical code in Numbers and Leviticus. And so the gates and the walls are purified. And then they do something really interesting. They divide the choirs and the musicians into 2 bodies, and they are going to actually march around the top of the wall in opposition to each other so that they meet at the end near the temple, marching in opposite directions. And they would meet at the temple for worship and celebration. All of them walking along the top of this newly completed wall. It must have been quite an interesting and exciting time for them. Eventually then we get to the close of the book of Nehemiah, which consists of his final measures in the community to bring them into alignment with the requirements of the law of Moses. One of the things all along has been the issue of religion and racial purity. Because if you intermarry with pagans, then the chances are greatly increased that you will fall into the religion of the pagans. And so Nehemiah wants to correct this. There were a number of things that happened, but one of the things he's going to make sure happens is that this issue of intermarriage with pagans is going to be halted. They did a number of other things. They appointed supervisors to manage the offerings for the priests and the Levites and those kinds of things. And during the reading of the Torah, the people discovered that they were not supposed to allow any foreigners into the temple. Well, many of them hadn't thought about that before. They weren't aware of that. And so this was a new discovery for them. Afterward, Nehemiah, for a period of time, is going to be called back by Artaxerxes to Mesopotamia. So he's going to be recalled back to Persia for a time. And during that time, one of the priests of the temple allows an Ammonite official to use one of the temple storage rooms. And in using that storage room, he is in direct violation of this command that no foreigners are to be in the temple. So when Nehemiah comes back from Persia after his brief recall, he discovers this Ammonite official and he corrects that. This man is going to have to be expelled from the temple, and they will need to purify the temple and not allow this to happen again. Also, in his return, Nehemiah discovered that some of the leaders had neglected to provide for the Levites. And some of the Levites are forced to go back to farming in order to survive. So he rectifies that and changes that. He also discovered that some of the merchants from Phoenicia had been allowed to set up booths for selling in Jerusalem, and this on the Sabbath day. So that violation is corrected. So what the Phoenician merchants did is, well, now they can't sell in the city on the Sabbath, so they go outside and they set up booths right outside the gate. And so Nehemiah closes the gates, but when they set up outside the gates, he decides, well, I've got to correct that, so he threatens to arrest them if they don't leave, and he stationed guards to make sure that on the Sabbath day there would be no buying and selling, there would be no commercial activity. The intermarriage of Israelites with non-Israelites was a continual threat, and so Nehemiah at this point kind of loses patience. Maybe I shouldn't say kind of. He does lose patience. He just kind of explodes. He curses them and punches them and pulls out their hair. He forces them to swear an oath that they will not do this anymore, that they will not be involved in this racial compromise and this religious syncretism. And so he tries to correct that. And he purifies the priesthood of everything that was foreign. And you finally get to the end of the book of Nehemiah, and in the last chapter, there are reflections again on 3 of his prayers, which are very symptomatic of the book. They sort of give you the feel of the whole sense of the book. The first one is this prayer: remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Remember them, O my God, because they defile the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. And then finally, at the very end, his final prayer: remember me with favor, O my God. And this brings us to the end of the book of Nehemiah, a wonderful book of a great leader in the ancient community of Israel.